You might be surprised to learn that when ancient historians approach the New Testament documents, the majority of scholars today accept the central facts undergirding the inference to the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to emphasize that I'm not talking here about conservative scholars or evangelical scholars. Rather, I'm talking about the broad mainstream of critical, historical, New Testament scholarship today. The work that is done by professors who teach at secular universities and non-evangelical theological colleges. Amazing as it may seem, most of them have come to agree with the historicity of the central facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus. The apostles proclaimed, and I quote, "God will judge the world by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." Acts chapter 17 and verse 31. The resurrection is God's public vindication of Jesus' radical personal claims to be the absolute revelation of God. The historian C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for a given body of historical facts. And I believe that the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all of these tests. Number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and why the Christian faith came into being. Second, it has great explanatory power. It explains why the body of Jesus was gone, why people repeatedly saw Jesus alive despite his earlier public execution, and so forth. 3, it is plausible. Given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, the resurrection serves as a divine confirmation or vindication of those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. Number 4, it is not ad hoc, that is to say, contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, and that is that God exists. And that needn't even be an additional hypothesis if you already believe that God exists. And I think that we do have sound philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Number 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, doesn't in any way conflict with the belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. The Christian accepts that belief as wholeheartedly as he accepts the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. And finally, number 6, it far outstrips any of its rival hypotheses in meeting criteria 1 through 5. Down through history, various alternative explanations of these 4 facts have been offered. For example, the conspiracy hypothesis, that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and lied about the resurrection appearances. The apparent death hypothesis, that Jesus was taken down from the cross alive and somehow escaped from the tomb and presented himself to the disciples. The hallucination hypothesis, that the disciples hallucinated post-mortem visions of Jesus and so forth. Such hypotheses, however, have been nearly universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. None of these naturalistic hypotheses succeeds in meeting the 6 criteria as well as does the resurrection hypothesis. Now, this puts the skeptical critic in a rather desperate situation. For example, a few years ago, I had a debate on the resurrection of Jesus at the University of California with a professor who had written his doctoral thesis on the evidence for the resurrection. He was thoroughly familiar with the evidence, and he could not deny the facts of the honorable burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, or the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. And so his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of these facts. And so he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him at birth, who grew up independently, no one knew about him, but who came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole his brother's body out of the tomb, and presented himself to the disciples, who mistakenly thought that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this theory, but I think that the example is instructive because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, did you know that the evidence is so powerful that one of the leading Jewish theologians of today, the late Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Jewish theologian, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. Now, if this is right, it has profound implications. The significance of the resurrection of Jesus lies in the fact that it's not just any old person that has been raised from the dead, but it is Jesus of Nazareth, whose crucifixion was instigated by the Jewish leadership because of his blasphemous claims to divine authority. If this man has been raised from the dead, then the God whom he allegedly blasphemed has publicly and unequivocally committed himself to him and vindicated those claims. The resurrection of Jesus is God's divine confirmation of Jesus' claims to have divine authority and to be the absolute revelation of God. Thus, in an age of religious pluralism and relativism, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus constitutes, I think, a solid rock on which Christians can take their stand on God's decisive self-revelation in Jesus.